Good evening, and thank you for joining us in our museum, the Museum of Newport Irish History. Welcome to the first presentation of this year's Crowley Lecture Series, as we, believe it or not, now enter our 19th year. I'm Mike Slane, and I have the pleasure of heading a wonderful group of high-spirited, talented board members, three of whom are responsible for this evening. Our presenter, Enzo Steve Marino, Ann Arnold May, who coordinates the Michael Crowley Lecture Series, and Dan Titus, the technical wizard and the brains behind this virtual Zoom presentation. Before I introduce Steve, whom I know you have been anxiously awaiting because I've been getting the phone calls, let me update you on a few happenings. When the pandemic came upon us in March, and we first realized there was the likelihood of not having our annual gala, we needed a vehicle to pay our rent and utility bills for the year. We instituted our first annual appeal in more than 10 years. And to say your response was enthusiastic is an understatement. You absolutely overwhelmed us. Your generosity enabled not only keeping the lights on, but also added significantly to our endowment fund for growth. And on Monday, we commenced the restoration and the painting of the wrought iron fence surrounding the Barney Street Cemetery, which has been so well cared for by Jack McCormick and many of you who volunteer throughout the year on the lawn and upkeep duties. My heartfelt thanks to each of you who contributed and enabled these important projects. If you still wish to donate, you may do so online on our website or by mailing a check to Post Office Box 1378, 1378 in Newport. Tonight, we are very fortunate also to have joining us many non-members from other organizations, such as St. Mary's Church, the Edward King Senior Center. Carmela Gear, the executive director there, graciously dispatched our invitation, and we received immediate responses from several people. And we welcome all of you non-members, if you enjoy tonight's offering, to consider joining the museum such that you will be on our mailing list for future events. And I encourage you to do so. It's a $20 fee for an individual membership for the year, and I believe well worth the money. Now let me provide a quick backdrop to tonight's presentation. Place yourself back in time in Ireland and Newport. The year is 1828. Ireland has just endured crop failures in 1816, 1819, again in 1822, and these preceded the Great Famine, the 7-year famine, which commenced in 1845. In 1827, the United States lessened the immigration restrictions. And between 1828 and 1837, remember those two dates, you will hear more about those two dates later. Between 1828 and 1837, nearly 400,000 Irish immigrated to the United States. Here in Newport, the Irish miners from Allihies on the Beara Peninsula, West Cork, had been mining the Portsmouth coal mines for nearly 20 years in 1828. The invisible Irish, the pre-famine Irish, the canal diggers had completed the Blackstone Canal to Worcester in the same year, 1828, and later worked on the Providence-Worcester rail line. They lived in row houses along the Blackstone River, from Woonsocket to Millville to Blackstone to Uxbridge to Whitensville and on into Worcester. There were two significant events during this time frame that overlay one another here. The span of 24 years, 1828 to 1852, the first Catholic parish in Rhode Island was founded, leading up to the dedication of St. Mary's Church in 1852. The second event was the construction of Fort Adams, the largest coastal fort in the United States, which spanned 4 decades and 33 years, 1824 to 1857. Although not a lot was recorded, we know that most lived in boarding houses outside the fort, and those Catholics who attended Mass would have worshiped at the Catholic parish on Barney Street. We also know that many of those laborers at Fort Adams donated their labor to building the foundation of St. Mary's Church in 1848 to 1849. Now Steve will connect the dots. Steve is a lifelong educator and a lifelong learner. He's a docent at the Interpreter Center, which he also manages. He's a tour guide extraordinaire at Fort Adams. And I encourage you, if you haven't had his tour at Fort Adams, go out there and request to get on his tour. He's always a treat, always dynamic, always spirited. He was educated at Williams College, Brown University, and the Hartford Seminary. He taught high school for more than 30 years in the Hartford area before retiring to Newport with his wife, Lynn. And we are the lucky beneficiaries. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Mike. If you've ever taken a bus tour with Mike of Irish Newport, you'll stop here at the corner of Barney Street and Mount Vernon Street. Today, you could visit the cemetery, but as Mike said, for almost 25 years, this was the center of the Irish Catholic community in Newport, Rhode Island. And it was also the location of Newport's, in Rhode Island's, first Catholic church. Now, there's been a great deal of controversy and mystery surrounding this church, and a lot has been written about it, and a lot has been debated. And we're going to go over that, and we're going to tell you what we know and what we don't know at this point. But I'd like to channel a little ditty that my older sisters taught me when I was just a boy. And what they used to do is interlace their hands like this, and they recited a little rhyme, and it went like this. You might know this one. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door and see all the people. And that's what I'd like to do tonight. I'd like to open the door of Rhode Island's first Catholic church and see all the people who worshiped there, the people who were married there, the people who baptized their children there and buried their dead in the churchyard outside. Because I really believe that by studying these individuals, we can add another layer of understanding of the early Irish Catholic community in Newport. Now, to give you an idea of where this piece of property is, as I said, it's on the corner of Barney Street and Mount Vernon Street in a block that's also bordered by Sherman Street and Spring Street. To give you some examples to orient yourself, this is Toro Synagogue. This is next door, the home of the Newport Historical Society, virtually across the street from the first Roman Catholic Church in Rhode Island. Around the corner is the First Baptist Church and the old Colony House on Washington Square, the Murray Courthouse. And if you're not familiar with any of those landmarks, I know some of you will recognize this one. This is the Fastnet Cafe on Broadway. So I hope that gives you an idea of where this piece of property is. Now, we know a little bit about this because the announcement in the Newport Mercury, which is our local paper here in Newport in the 1820s and 30s, one of them, this is in April, and it's a very short little two-sentence article. Catholic Church in Newport, Esquire, as an academy, has recently been purchased by the Right Reverend Bishop Fenwick of Boston for the purpose of establishing a Roman Catholic church in this town. This is the first Catholic church ever established in Rhode Island. Now that two sentences establishes quite a few things. Number one, who owned it? Who bought it? What was the purpose of buying it? And most importantly, it establishes that this was the first Catholic church established in Rhode Island. Now, what do we know about this church? Not a heck of a lot. We know that it was built in 1809 because Trevitt put an advertisement in the paper, and he's announcing the opening of his new academy on Barney Street. This is the building we're talking about. He calls it New and Airy. That's a good word, Airy Academy. And he boasts that of the pleasantness of the situation in the accommodation of the building. It's in a nice spot in town, and it's big enough for a school. That doesn't really tell us everything. We also know that it took about a month to build this building, because 1 month before, in March of 1809, Trevitt puts this advertisement in the paper. He's looking for carpenters and lumber and stone because he wants a building for a school. And he makes a deal with the carpenters. If they help him build the school, he'll pay their tuition and teach them how to read and write. So it took a month to build. We also know, this is interesting, that in 1815, his little schoolhouse was thrown off its foundation during a storm, partly into the adjoining lot. And he just leaves it there and runs the school out of the disjointed building, which is thrown off its foundation. This is not the Taj Mahal, okay? It takes a month to build, it gets thrown around, and eventually gets put back on its foundation. The other thing we know about this building is that almost immediately, within weeks, a Catholic priest who's living in Providence, his name is the Reverend Robert Woodley, he comes down, he preaches and says Mass in the church. So it's operating as a Catholic church immediately after it's purchased in 1828. Also, when the bishop hears about this, and this is Bishop Benedict Fenwick in Boston, and in his journal, which you can find in the archives of the Archdiocese of Boston, he writes in his journal, quote, "The lot of ground with the schoolhouse in Newport has been purchased by Reverend Mr. Woodley. This is the first Catholic church established in that state." That's my emphasis, not his. And he adds, "It is hoped that another will soon be erected at Providence, or at least at Pawtucket in its vicinity." Now, this is compelling evidence, okay? And I'm with the bishop on this. This is definitely the first Catholic church established in the state. If you didn't believe the Newport Mercury, you can certainly believe the bishop. Now, it seems as though Woodley was hot on Newport. The bishop, not so much. Woodley had been visiting 7 places, and you can see the 7 places. I've listed them here: Pawtucket, Portsmouth Coal Mines, Cranston, and Woonsocket. But he liked Newport for the church, and when the property became available, he jumped on it. And I think, this is my opinion, I think the reason he did is because of what was going on at the construction site at Fort Adams. You really have to realize that prior to the Civil War, Fort Adams was one of the largest construction sites in the entire United States. It employed hundreds of workers who got paid much better than the canal workers. And there were hundreds of them. In Portsmouth, there might have been 50 or 60 coal miners. There were 200, 300, 400 workers who got paid $1 a day, which was pretty good. And it wasn't seasonal, they were stable. And so when Woodley looks for a Catholic Irish community to sustain a church, he chooses Newport. Well, the bishop comes, and he comes later in the year, in November, and he takes his first look at his new acquisition, his new church in Rhode Island. When he arrives in the morning, he administers the sacrament of confirmation. And then in the afternoon at 3 o'clock, he preached. Now in the morning, he expresses his dismay, and he's greatly disappointed at the size, not only of the building, but of the piece of property. He privately tells Woodley that he thinks he got ripped off, taken to the cleaners on this deal. The lot's too small, the church is too mean, and he's disappointed. His mood improves in the afternoon when he preaches. He is thrilled with, quote, the strangers and Protestants who show up to hear him preach. And I think this has a lot to do with the location of the church. You could take a stroll anywhere in Newport and end up at the corner of Barney Street and Mount Vernon Street. And they did. They were curious about the bishop from Boston who's coming to preach in this new church. Now, Woodley's no dope. When the bishop expressed these two opinions in his visit in November, Woodley gets right to work. When the property adjacent to his original purchase is available in 1830, he adds that to the church holdings. And then in 1833, the corner lot becomes available and the property is consolidated into one piece. And when it is, almost immediately, plans are made for a new church to replace the schoolhouse turned church. Now, that job falls to Father Woodley's replacement, Father John Corey. And this is an advertisement that Corey puts in the paper in 1833, and he's asking for proposals to build a new church. Now, it takes him a while. He has to raise the money, he has to get proposals, and it takes him until 1836 to get the church completed, and it's dedicated in 1837. Here it is on the 1850 map that's available on the Library of Congress website. You can see it here on the corner. Now, we know a little bit about this church. We know a little bit more about this church because in the 1856 Newport City Directory, they have an inventory of all the places of worship in Newport. And number 12 is St. Joseph's Church. Now, I blew it up so you can see it better. St. Joseph's Church, Catholic, was established in 1828. The building, which is on Mount Vernon Street, measures 40 by 65 feet and seats by computation 450. It was erected between 1833 and 1836. So that's the new church, St. Joseph's Church it's called. Now you got to realize in 1856, St. Mary's is built and fully operational. St. Mary's is the Newport church. So this is no longer operating, but it's still there. And it doesn't last too much longer because in 1864, workmen at present are busy stripping off the boards and taking up the floor previous to its removal of the old Catholic church on Mount Vernon Street. And the next atlas map in 1876, all that's left of the two buildings is the Catholic cemetery. Both the schoolhouse and St. Joseph's Church, the bigger second church, are gone. The mystery is what happened to that schoolhouse church? And I think we have to start that investigation in 1962. Now, these two photographs show the corner of Barney and Mount Vernon Street. And I'm not sure exactly when they were taken. They were in the files of the Museum of Newport Irish History. But this photograph is looking east up Barney Street, and you can see that there's a large wooden fence bordering and hiding the cemetery. This photograph is looking south on Mount Vernon Street, showing the corner, and you can see the large wooden fence surrounding the plot of land. This shows you what's happening inside. It's overgrown. The fence has fallen down. You can see here it's been bolstered. There's garbage, and it's a mess. It's an eyesore. It seems, Newport folklore now, that there was a mayor of Newport who lived on Mount Vernon Street, and he was just fed up with this. And he leads an effort to clean up the old cemetery property, and he turns this into this. Now, according to the Newport Daily News, all the stones in the cemetery are lifted up, brought to St. Columba Cemetery, to their workshop. They're cleaned. The property is bulldozed and cleared. Fill was put in, grass was planted, and then the stones were laid flat so they could maintain the property easily. Now, this project in 1962 really brought back the whole history of the first two churches that were here. And people started to wonder, as we do now, what happened to that first church? Well, the people over on the point thought that the church probably was moved to 3rd Street over in their neighborhood. Now, they thought this because they had a photograph of a house on 71 3rd Street, and the photograph, which looked like this sketch, had a belfry on it. And the old timers in town, in the area, said, this might be Trevitt's schoolhouse. Now, this sketch appears in the Point Association's newsletter called The Green Light. And in the article, it tells about going to the Newport Historical Society and asking them to investigate. Could this building at 71 3rd Street be Eliezer Trevitt's schoolhouse? And this is a quote from the article. Mrs. Gladys Bolhouse of the Newport Historical Society believes it could be the Barney Street schoolhouse of Eliezer Trevitt, which property he sold in 1828. Now, she's being very careful here. Gladys Bolhouse was the Newport city historian for years. And she says it could be. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it could be. There is a case to be made. 2 years ago, Rhode Island Monthly Magazine runs an article. This is 2 years ago in October. A schoolhouse turned first Catholic church in Rhode Island is in the title. And they categorically state in this article, in the mid-1800s, the schoolhouse was moved to 3rd Street, where it resides today. And there's a photograph of 71 3rd Street. Now, based on this article, 71 3rd Street is renovated and the belfry is put back on. And this is 3rd Street today, looking very much like the sketch from 1962. Okay, so that's the end of the story. The mystery solved. It's at 71 3rd Street. Well, not so fast. Because meanwhile, on the other side of town, about 100 years ago, this souvenir book commemorating the consecration of St. Joseph's Church, 1922, has this photograph in it with the simple caption of Trevitt House. Now, this house was on Sherman Street in 1922. There is no text that goes along with this. It's in a section of the souvenir book that talks about the history of St. Joseph's Church. In 1985, celebrating their 100th birthday, St. Joseph's has another book published. Same photograph. First Catholic church erected in Newport, August 30th, 1837. That doesn't muddy the waters. Sherman Street. And then just 10 years ago, celebrating its 125th year of service, they run the exact same photograph. And this time, it explicitly states Trevitt House, first church, which is now on Sherman Street. So we have conflicting narratives here. Enter this very seductive theory, which tells the story or posits that the original schoolhouse was moved from here to there, 250 feet, somewhere in the 1830s. This is certainly appealing. It's right through someone's backyard, and you're on 19 Sherman Street. And enter the Museum of Newport Irish History, who is sponsoring this talk this evening. Their first initiative, really, in 1997 was to literally resurrect the gravestones that were placed flat in 1962, and basically turning this into this. And that's the way it looks today. Now, during this effort, once again, like in 1962, this is in late 1990s, there's a lot of interest in what happened to the church that was here, that spawned this graveyard. And the Museum of Newport Irish History got the help of a Salve University professor named Dr. James Garman. And they asked him to do an assessment of the documentary evidence surrounding the first Roman Catholic church in Newport. And he does. And it's a fascinating 8 or 9 page report. However, and I quote from it, "No smoking gun links the property at 19 Sherman Street directly to the first Roman Catholic church in Newport." Now, as I said, there's no smoking gun, but boy, the circumstantial evidence that Dr. Garman has in his report prompts the Museum of Newport Irish History to go to the Newport Historical Society with Dr. Garman's report in hand and say, could you please put together an ad hoc panel of experts to assess not only Dr. Garman's findings, but also get an architect, an archaeologist, and a state historian, and put together a panel to assess this information. And they do. And their final line of their 3-page report in 2001, and I quote, "As of yet, the evidence at hand, while highly suggestive and interesting, is not conclusive. And in the opinion of this panel, the building's identity remains in doubt." So we have a mystery on our hands. And you know, I suppose it really doesn't matter what happened to the first Catholic church in Rhode Island. But what I do think matters is the effect of the church on the early Irish Catholic community and that community's relationship to the larger Newport community. And I think we can get an idea of this relationship early on by a book that's published by the Reverend Arthur Ross. He's the pastor of the First Baptist Church, which is right around the corner to the first Catholic church in Rhode Island. And this Baptist minister writes in this piece this assessment of Catholics in his first 10 years as being their neighbor. He writes, "Catholics studiously avoid all interference with and uniformly respect the rights of all denominations in this place. And this feeling is mutual and reciprocated by every sect of Protestant Christians in this town. Now, what leads Pastor Ross to give this glowing assessment of the Catholic community in 1838? And I think the answer could be found in the stories of the individuals who were there. So let's open the doors of this church and see all the people. And I'll give you an example. John and Margaret Callahan. Now, John and Margaret Callahan, both born in Ireland, immigrants, they baptized their son John in the church on Barney Street in 1829. But a year earlier, they buried Thomas, their son, age 15 months, in the churchyard outside. 5 years later, they bury another son, Michael, age 16 months. But I think the inscription, which you can not see here, but it's indicated in this photograph, it's a gospel scripture. A gospel scripture that all denominations of Christians in Newport recognize. Jeffrey and Ann O'Reilly have a similar fate. They baptized their daughter, one of the very first in the Catholic Church, in 1828. Jeffrey is working at Fort Adams, but in 1831, a few years later, he buries his daughter Mary, age 9 months, in the graveyard outside the first Catholic church in Rhode Island. But he goes on with Anne to have 5 sons. And the youngest one, he named Jefferson. He's Jeffrey, born in Ireland, but his son is Jefferson, born in the United States. And through a little research, I think there are 5 generations of Jefferson Rileys or O'Reillys that are spawned from this couple living in Rhode Island. And somebody out there who's watching this might be a descendant of Jeffrey and Ann O'Reilly. And by the way, if you are, we would be thrilled to hear from you. The guy I feel closest to is John Quigley. Okay, now John Quigley is alive and well at the Providence Children's Museum. And there's an exhibit of him. And if you go to the exhibit, there he is, big as life. And John Quigley is working at Fort Adams, and a couple of his buddies, the Duggan brothers, introduce him to their sister, Margaret. And one thing leads to another. And Margaret Duggan and John Quigley are married in 1833. And thanks to his granddaughter's diary, she writes about how crowded the little edifice was and how pretty the bride looked. You really get right down into that church in 1833. It's crowded, it's a great day, the bride looks great, and it's a summertime wedding in Newport. What could be better? And it's right in the middle of town. Probably the first marriage that takes place in the church is Brian Doyle and Catherine Hickey, both of Ireland. Now, I wanted you to see how Father Woodley records this in his baptismal and wedding register. I married Brian Doyle to Miss Catherine Hickey, and then he says what the witnesses are, and then he signs it, R. Woodley. And the date is over here in the margin. And marriages are in parentheses, baptisms aren't. This marriage doesn't last very long. Brian Doyle dies 3 months later, suddenly, at the age of 57. Another wedding that I'd like to point out is William Savage and Mary Doyle. Now, William Savage is not Irish, and he's not Catholic. As a matter of fact, Father Woodley makes a big point of this. I married William Savage, a Presbyterian, to Miss Mary Doyle. Now, they get married in the church because Mary Doyle wants them to get married in the church. Another example of this is Robert Dunham. Now, Robert Dunham was a Mayflower descendant. He is not Irish, and he's not Catholic. And he has 9 children with his first wife, who passes away in 1825. So he's looking for a wife, and he finds one in the Irish Catholic community, and Casey. And they get married in the Catholic Church. Another example of this is Edward Landers and Margaret Murphy. Now, they're not married in the church because it's not purchased yet, but they get married in 1828. Edward Landers is not Catholic and he is not Irish, but Margaret Murphy is. And so they get married in the church or by the church. And she gives birth to a son in the year next and dies a month later. So what we see happening here is New England men looking for wives and finding them in the Irish Catholic community. But it works the other way. There are New England women looking for husbands, and they find them in the Irish Catholic community. And my favorite story is about 2 sisters, Edie and Mary Cox, daughters of Mr. George Cox of this town. Now, I guess Mary has the more interesting story. Mary is the eldest daughter. She gets married to a guy named Henry Freeborn early in the 1820s, has 3 children with Henry Freeborn, and then Henry dies in 1825. So Mary Cox Freeborn marries a second time to Daniel McCarty of Boston, who comes down to Newport to look for work at Fort Adams. Her sister follows suit, and Edith Cox also finds an Irishman to marry, Mr. John Ring of Boston, who is also down here working at the construction site at Fort Adams. Now, the connection with the Catholic Church is that as soon as the Catholic Church is operational, Mary goes and gets baptized at the age of 32 and makes a public profession of Catholic faith during Mass. In that same afternoon, she gets her kids baptized. Now, these children are not Irish and they're not Catholic, neither are either of their parents, but they're baptized in the church. Her sister follows suit, Edith. I supplied the ceremony of baptism for Mrs. Edith Ring. Now, she's 27 years old, who made a previous profession of Catholic faith. Now, Edith is getting baptized because she married John Ring. And Edith, when she has her first child, they baptize her in the church by Father Woodlight. And when she has her second child, another daughter, she's baptized in the church. So what you see happening here is both geographically and demographically, the Irish Catholic community is being woven in to the larger Newport community. And I think that has an impact for decades, if not centuries. And I'll give you my favorite example. But before I do that, remember I told you when the bishop came, he administered the sacrament of confirmation? Well, here they are. There's 11 of them. This is Newport's first confirmation class. All right. 11 souls gathered in to the Catholic faith. There's Edith Ring and Mary Catherine McCarthy, he writes. This Elizabeth Dunn, after doing a little research, she's not Irish, she's not Catholic. Her name is Elizabeth Lucy. And Elizabeth Lucy gets baptized and confirmed in the Catholic faith because she wants to marry John Dunn, who's working out at Fort Adams. Julia Whaling, she's not Irish. She's not Catholic, but she's interested in James Fogarty, who's up at the Portsmouth coal mines, and eventually marries John Fogarty. Sarah Delaney is not Sarah Delaney. Sarah Delaney is not Catholic, and she's not Irish, but she's already married James Delaney, a laborer at Fort Adams, and so she gets baptized at the age of 19, and then she gets confirmed. Walter Dalton is not Catholic, and he's not Irish, and I don't know his story, but what you can see here, again, is the Catholic community, the story of the early Newport Irish is becoming the story of Newport. And my favorite, as I said before, is John and Edith Ring. Now, John and Edith Ring have 4 children. Margaret, I told you, was baptized. She's the oldest. She was baptized in the church in 1828. Elizabeth arrives in 1829. And then George, and John is the youngest. John marries an Irish girl, and Elizabeth marries a Gladding, and Margaret marries his cousin, another Gladding. John Ring has a slew of children. But so does his sister. And Margaret has a couple of kids. All of these children, all of these individuals are first cousins. They share the same grandparents. They live in the same town. They know each other. All of the Rings throughout their whole lives identify as Irish Catholics. All of the Gladdings don't. I know that there are descendants of John Ring and probably the Gladdings who are watching this right now. And if you are a descendant, we'd love to hear from you. And I would like to end this with a plea. If you have any information about any of your ancestors who might have worshiped or received sacraments at the first Catholic church in this state of Rhode Island, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. This is not a done deal. This is a work in progress, because I really truly believe that by telling the story of these earliest Irish Catholics in town, we get a better view and a richer view of the Irish Catholic experience and the Newport experience in the 1820s and 30s. And with that, I am going to turn this back to Mike. Mike.
All right, Mike is on his way over to see you, Steve.
Dan thinks we're better off just handling the questions right here.
Okay.
I just don't know what the procedure is going to be.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Now, I've just been told that we're going to open this for questions.
Now,
And
from a technical point of view, I've now allowed people to unmute themselves and let the pandemonium begin.
Okay.
okay, I'm ready.
Okay, I'll be first.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so why can't that schoolhouse-looking building be the one on 3rd Street. And then the second building that was a church be the one on Sherman Street. It doesn't look like a church, but a lot can happen over the years. And was there ever a picture of that first church that was built as a church in the 30s? No?
No, there was never a photograph. I mean, we're talking about the 1830s. No, there was nothing. I'm kind of like Goldilocks on this question. I think the 3rd Street house is too small and the Sherman Street house is too big. But, and this is another cry for help. I think the key to this is that 1962 rehabilitation of the corner lot. And the reason I say that is there's a couple of very intriguing Newport Daily News articles that state that a cellar was filled in, the stones were removed and where they were put back. And I think there's someone out there listening right now that either worked on that project, rehabilitating the site in 1962, or maybe they were a child playing behind the fence. And believe me, we're not going to judge you if you turn yourself in at this point. But we would love to talk to you. Maybe you have a photograph of what the property looked like in 1962. But unfortunately, Rita, no, we don't know enough about that first church. I told you almost everything we know. And if we could get a sense of the size of it, I think it would help answer the question and solve the mystery. I hope that answers your question.
Yep, thank you.
Hello? Hello? Hi.
Hi, Patrick. Patricia?
Yeah, Patricia.
Patricia, hi.
I'm wondering if, like the John Stevens shop, which is on Thames Street in Newport, there's the shop, and then right across the street, there's the John Stevens house. So could that other building have been a rectory? The one on Sherman Street? Because it's
Sure.
labeled the Trevitt House.
That's an intriguing idea. None of the maps show a rectory there. There's no indication that it was owned by the Catholic Church because Dr. Garman did look at the land records. And so there's no record of the Catholic Church owning it. So when it was moved, it fell into private hands
Right.
if it was moved to Sherman Street.
Oh, well.
Now, speaking of the John Stevens, the Celtic cross that you see in some of the photographs, and I can't get it back, but that Celtic cross, I believe, came from the John Stevens stone cutting establishment.
Well, I
And-
worked there for 35 years. So
Well, I contacted them.
I could
I guess,
definitely tell you if it did.
yeah, thank you. Because I think John Benson would have been the person who carved it and donated it. But I guess his grandson, Nick, is now in charge. And I contacted them, and I would love to get an answer about the origins of the Celtic cross and why it was donated.
Okay, I can do that for you.
Oh, this is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted to have happen. Thank you, Patricia.
You're welcome. And now I have to go.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a great
Okay.
lecture.
Any other questions? This is working out way better than I thought.
Steve, there's a question written in from Patty Lynch on To Everyone. It says, Patty says, did Jim Garman use any ground penetrating radar in his research?
No, it's specifically documentary. And, probably, I don't know in 2001 whether we had any in town. I know we have some now, and I've seen it work. And that's a great suggestion. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. And maybe we should do that work. I think we need to know where the gravestones were. And as a sidelight, I just want to make this clear. There are scores, if not hundreds, of people buried in that cemetery, and they do not have stones. Okay, we know that. We know that people were buried without stones, lots of them. Okay, and it was rare that an Irish immigrant could raise the money to get a stone. And some of these people didn't have families around. Okay, they came by themselves and were working at the fort. And if they passed away, there was nobody to carve a stone for them. No. And so it would be interesting to get some ground penetrating radar out there. Good suggestion. Thank you. Ms. Lynch.
I have a question. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
I have always thought that St. Mary's Church was the first Catholic church, not only in Newport, but in the state of Rhode Island. Can you
You got cut off. I'm sticking with Bishop Fenwick on this. Okay. I'm throwing myself in with the bishop, and he says it's the schoolhouse, and so does the Newport Mercury, and so does everybody else. Oh, that's not true. I'm sticking with the bishop. I rest my case.
It's Steve, the oldest parish is St. Mary's. The oldest building is a different question.
Okay.
So St. Mary's, what's now St. Mary's Parish that descended from what happened at Barney Mount Vernon is the oldest parish. So that's true.
Yeah, I'm not a canon law expert, but that word parish means something that I don't fully understand. There was a Catholic priest who tried to explain it to me one day. Up until a certain point, all the churches, no, I'm not going to explain this correctly, but I was told that up until a certain point, all the churches in the United States were considered missions. And they were controlled by the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, I believe. And then at a certain point, one of the popes changes that. Well, in the absence of any further questions, and I think maybe we will end this, and please, okay, I don't want this to be the end of this conversation. I would love to hear from you, either on the mystery of the First Catholic Church or on any ancestors that you might have had that worshiped there, okay? And I think I'm getting it. If anybody's still listening, our Gmail address is newportirishhistory@gmail.com.